Hello and welcome to World Talks with me, Ashim Kumar. Tonight we examine the G7 summit in Évian, France, where Ukraine, Iran, energy trade and global economic stability dominates the agenda. With Iain Begg, we discuss China's shadow over supply chains, South Africa's absence and why invited partners like India, Egypt, Qatar and the UAE matter. Iain, welcome to TVP World. Welcome back, I should say, and thanks for taking the time.
It's nice to be with you.
So a lot, obviously, on the G7 agenda, but I would like to start by asking you about both the war in Ukraine and the war in Iran, which is currently seems to have been suspended. Economically speaking, what has the impact been globally of those two conflicts?
Well, the unifying phenomenon between the two wars has been what it's done to energy prices. We saw that with restrictions on effectively closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that drove up oil prices and gas prices because the supply was constrained. And if you look at what happened with the Ukraine war, it was very much the same, because European countries particularly said we are going to cease, or at least slow down our consumption of Russian gas. Both these things drove up European energy prices and have made Europe relatively less competitive. Now, the oil price has also affected the US, and the big challenge that Donald Trump is facing as he moves towards the midterm elections is that the Americans are deeply sensitive to what they call gas prices. They go up by a few cents a gallon or by $1 a gallon, and you have a very restive population who's going to complain about it.
Right, so, okay, but I mean, a lot of countries have turned away, for example, from Russian oil. You have the shadow fleet of tankers, which are being stopped, finally, and therefore, Russia is becoming less and less important as a source of oil and gas. Would you agree?
No, I think I don't agree with that, because Russia has been able to turn to alternative markets. It started off by sending oil to India at discount prices. It sees China as a major market for its hydrocarbons, both oil and gas. There's a project to build a pipeline from Siberia to China to replace the pipelines that used to go into Europe. So I think there's a diversion going on. Plus, as you mentioned in your introduction, the shadow fleet is a means by which Russia has been able to continue to provide oil to different parts of the world. So, yes, there is pressure on Russia. There are sanctions against Russia, but their exports of oil have held up pretty well.
Right. Now, the other thing, related to the hydrocarbon and energy sector, we had Middle Eastern countries like Qatar and UAE attending the G7. What does that tell you? Clearly, energy is a big part of those economies.
Well, it tells us, yes, energy again, but it also tells us that they were seen as what's the expression that they sometimes use in the military? Collateral damage, I think it is. Collateral damage of the attempts by Israel and the United States to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age. So that I think there'll be an attempt going on to mollify the Gulf states in particular and ensure that they stay within what you might loosely call the Western family rather than look elsewhere.
All right. What about India then? You mentioned India earlier as a customer for Russian oil. Why was India invited?
Well, I am not privy to the inside discussions on particularly why India, but a simple answer is that India is a big economy. It's an expanding economy. It's the world's most populous economy. So what happens in India, particularly in the future, is going to be very significant for the G7 countries, which, after all, is dominated by European countries. And they will see India as the next big adventure that they can use to try to gain advantages in what we loosely call the global south. India is also a big technology power because it has these huge outputs of engineers that are dealing in software and related industries. So maybe India has been neglected while all the focus has been in China in the last decade or so. But India is going to be the coming power economically, not least because both Europe and China are projected to have declining populations in the near future, whereas India's is still expanding.
Right, yes, but I mean, India has always been strictly neutral ever since its independence. Do you see its presence at G7 a sign that it is perhaps moving more westward in its thinking and its future policy?
Whether it's already moving or whether it's an attempt to be more friendly towards India is maybe the way to phrase the question. I suspect it's the latter. You want to bring India into the fold. Now, there's something else that the Americans have launched at the end of last year, which is the so-called Pax Silica. If you've not heard the expression, you can work out the Latin for that. That's a peace based on silicon. And the US is putting this forward under its leadership as an attempt by other parts of the world, and the signatories include India, to try to obtain a position in the new industries around artificial intelligence, where India is going to have strengths, the new generations of chips, the new attempts to find the scarce resources, the critical minerals, which are going to be required to ensure that the West still has a strong position in these areas. So I can see a very strong logic for saying we want India inside our tent and not being tempted to join the Chinese.
Yes, but it's not just Europe inviting India inside the tent, it's India agreeing to be inside the tent, which perhaps might indicate its changing political thinking, do you think?
It may also be an element of my enemy is my friend, in that India and China have not been the best of buddies in the past, and although they're technically part of the so-called BRICS, along with South Africa, Brazil, and Russia, that's a very, very peculiar organization, which is in part countries which are very much dependent on resources like Russia, and in part the emerging manufacturers like China. So India will want, I think, to have a foot in both camps, in other words, to play off one against the other.
Right, now you mentioned China, and another agenda item is about critical minerals and supply chain resilience. Is this about China without mentioning China?
Well, it's about the fact that China has a particular stranglehold on rare earths, which are critical for batteries and many of the other products that are going to be central to the digital age. Now, what the G7 will want to do is to open up alternative sources of supply so they're not held to ransom by China. And some of the countries that are being invited, I agree, the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo is not, but they're an example of a country where there are abundant potential supplies of these scarce minerals. Australia is another, and the G7 will be keen to nurture links with countries that are able to substitute for China in this particular stranglehold.
But what about supply chain? I mean, one would have thought that after COVID and the impact it had on supply chains and shortages across the world because things weren't getting out of China, one would have thought that countries would have learned their lesson on the delicacy of supply chains from China and diversified, but they haven't. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells you one thing, which is developing new sources, particularly of critical minerals, is slow. You've got to identify where there are stocks of it, and you have to set up the mining operations, and that's not something that happens overnight. Now, the fact that China was a source of supply up to now, and then you tried to use it, particularly against the United States, as a means of resisting the Trump tariffs that he was trying to impose on China, tells you that China is able to recognize where they have a trump card to play, if you could excuse the play on words. And in this case, the solution for European countries, and to some extent for the US, is say, right, where else do we go to find an alternative to China? So it's a constantly evolving game where you're playing your cards and then finding that somebody else has an alternative card they can play, which overcomes yours. I'll stop using the word Trump.
All right, which trumps your Trump. Now, in terms of In terms of, I'd like to move on now to Ukraine, and President Zelensky and President Trump have met twice, in fact, already at the G7, and it has been suggested by President Zelensky that Putin came along and peace talks commence. Is there anything that the G7 or any other country can do to pressure Russia to the negotiating table?
Well, here we have the problem that Trump has been waxing and waning in his support for Ukraine. One time he's reasonably favourable towards them when he meets Zelensky, and then he goes away and Putin talks to him, and suddenly Trump is in more towards Putin's camp on this. So Trump's vacillations in relation to Ukraine have not been easy for the Ukrainians to deal with. Plus, the mere fact that so much of the US energy over the last 3 months has been focused on Iran has meant not only loss of focus, but also the potential stocks of defensive weaponry, Patriot missiles and so on, has not been available to Ukraine. There comes a point, I think we have to accept, where any war drags on for so long that both sides are going to say, in the end, we have to find a solution to this. Putin keeps saying, no, I still have my ambitions for what I want to do in Ukraine. They've not been met, therefore I will continue with my so-called special military operation. But war fatigue will eventually cut in. It's longer now than the First World War, which after all was a pretty devastating conflict. So I think there's a beginning of a building up of momentum to do something about Ukraine. And if, it remains an if, Iran is now on the way to being solved, irrespective of what Israel might do, then it's possible that the G7 will start to pull the focus back towards Ukraine, which can only be good news for Zelensky and his citizens.
Indeed, but so long as, of course, Putin actually takes concrete steps towards a sustainable peace. Now, you mentioned the Patriot missiles and various other munitions and materiel. President Zelensky has asked the US for a license to manufacture Patriot missiles in Ukraine and in other countries in Europe. How likely is it, do you think, that they will get that license?
I think it's a rather long shot, because the US is very touchy about its advantage in producing these very high quality weapons to deal with aerial threats, and I think they'll be quite reluctant to let that out in a way which even carries the risk of reverse engineering to enable anybody licensing it to do it for themselves in the future. So I'm no expert on military procurement, but I'd say that's on the unlikely end of the spectrum.
Indeed. Well, Iain Begg, as always, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a good evening.
Same to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.